Hey guys, it's Bella, and this week I want to teach you how to read the Uncial scripts from late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. So, in the original lecture, we included Litera Capitalis Rustica, but we've covered it in the last lecture, so I'm not going to go over it too much. And let's just dive in with some terminological distinctions which will become important in how we talk about script moving forward. So, the minim is the smallest unit excluding dots within a script, and it's usually a line, and it's usually, imagine the I just without the dot on top. That's a minim, from the Latin word minimus, minimate, meaning the smallest thing. There's a distinction we need to make between majuscule and minuscule scripts. So a majuscule script is a script which fits between two lines, and actually you can kind of see it in the difference between the uppercase and lowercase letters in that sentence itself, right? So in that one, let me find some letters that, yes, okay, so in that one, the E and the L in the word majuscule, they come to the same height, right? They fit between the same two lines, whereas in the last word, lines, which is written in lowercase, the top of the E is lower than the top of the L, because the lowercase script fits between four lines. That's because the lowercase script is what we call a minuscule script, and a minuscule script is a script which fits between four lines. And a minuscule script has ascenders which go above the minim height, so above the I, and descenders which go below it. Relatively self-explanatory. And a last distinction is between sort of capital and cursive scripts. So these things aren't sort of strictly defined terms, they're not polar opposites, but as a general rule, a script that we describe as a capital script, such as Litera Capitalis Rusticana, Litera Capitalis Quadrata, Litera Uncialis, these are better suited for display, so they're more pretty to look at and they take longer to write out. Whereas cursive scripts are written at speed and they incorporate more abbreviations or ligatures for use in legal or everyday contexts. Some more terminological distinctions, I know, but then we will get on to the scripts. Okay, so this is important though because it lets you navigate medieval manuscript databases online, and we will include some training on how to do that later on. In fact, I already have it in my video guide to Middle English manuscripts, although that is tailored more specifically to Middle English manuscripts. But so the time spans during which a script is used before it either evolves into a different script or it is replaced by different letter forms, that time span is described using broad brackets in paleography because, with the exception of a scribe whose lifespan we know and we can know when they lived or died, which is quite rare, it does happen, but it's rare. It's really difficult to know a precise start or end date of a kind of script. However, we normally use broad ranges of time to give a rough idea of when a script starts coming into use and when it fades out of use. So in order to refer to these, we say sec with the dot, and that's shorthand for seculo, meaning in the century. The number of the century is given with Roman numerals after the sec, and then if a manuscript dates between the years 1 to 25 of said century, we write the incip after the numeral, and if it's between years 75 to 99, we use explit with the dot after the numeral, and if it's between 26 to 74, so basically in the middle, we put med. So fairly self-explanatory, incipit for it begins, for the beginning, explicit for explicit at the end, and then med for medium, for middle. That identifies which one it is. So if I write down sake, vi med, that means seculum, sextum medium, which is sort of middle of the 6th century, so it'll be the 550-ish, around the time that they say the Ostrogothic kingdom is coming to an end. Sad face. I would have done, in a regular lecture, a recap of Litera Capitalis Rusticana, but you've already seen this, you don't need a recap. What I will though do is show you this sample from Paris BNFM is Latin 11326, folios 2R and 2B. These are a bunch of songs by Saint Prosperous, but what's interesting about them is you can see in both of these, you can see Uncial script, which we'll get to in a second, written in red, being used for either the main text or for headers. So in the bottom half of this screen, the Uncial script is being used for the main text of the songs. The text of the preface, but rustic capitals are being used for chapter headings in both halves of the screen. So in the second half, next to the big cross, it says Incipit Prefatio Libri Epigrammatorum Sancti Prosperis. So here begins the preface of the book of epigrams by Saint Prosper. And that's between the two crosses, and that is the sort of title of the text, and it's written in rustic capitals to distinguish it from the main body of the text, which begins in rustics, dum sacris mentem placet exercere loqui, blah blah blah. So you can see how they're using rustic capitals as a highlighting script in medieval texts. So now we get on to what you have just seen a little bit of in the red text of Litera Uncialis, and it was used between the 4th and the 8th centuries, and it is often referred to as like the first minuscule. So Litera Uncialis, which is known as Uncial script, it developed as a sort of compromise between rustic capitals and cursive script. So its letter forms can usually be made with fewer pen strokes, but it still looks very nice. It's still a capital script. And these letter forms draw a sharper distinction between quite a few letters which in other contemporary scripts, both capital and more cursive scripts, were actually quite confusable. You might have noticed in Litera Capitalis Rusticana, the E and the F in particular, it's like the top shoulder stroke, so the top horizontal stroke on the F is a bit longer than the one on the E, and that's about it. That's like the only difference. So they really are very easy to get confused. And the R and the S in cursive script are very hard to tell apart also. And Uncial script tries to clear up some of these confusions a little bit. And these forms of Uncial script were made possible because it's mostly associated with papyrus codices with parchment, with vellum, so animal skins, rather than writing on papyrus like Old Roman and later Roman cursive was, which requires different kinds of strokes. So the distinguishing features of Uncial is an M formed with curved strokes. Like basically the McDonald's logo is the M of Uncial. That's your really iconic Uncial script. And the curved strokes in your other letters are generally a bit broader in an Uncial script. You have P, Q and F. They'll have like a small descender which goes below the baseline, but their descender is normally only about half of the height of a minim, so half of the height of an I. So they don't go very far below the minim line, which makes it sometimes a bit hard to notice the descenders. And then you have D, H and L, which rise a little bit above the minim line. You have curved shapes for E, S and R. So if you see a tall S or a sort of tall R, you'll know that it's not Uncial. And the sort of rounded E is also fairly unique, not uniquely, but it's iconically Uncial. And lastly, in Uncial, the U is formed by two vertical strokes, as opposed to Litera Capitalis Rusticana, where you have one sort of slanting stroke and then one vertical stroke. And H is formed by one vertical stroke and a smaller curved stroke about halfway through. So let's have a look at these letter forms. So there is the A. You can see that the A, and that little triangle on the A, that can sometimes be curved. It can sometimes be a circle. That's more prone to vary. We can see the D as well, the sort of the sloped D. It almost looks like an O, but with a little line going off at the top towards the left hand side. That's quite iconic Uncial. The Uncial E, there we are, it's quite common. You'll notice that the form of the F, it doesn't have the serif at the bottom that it does in Litera Capitalis Rusticana, and none of these as well. So the H, the the N, the I's, they don't have the serifs at the bottom that Litera Capitalis Rusticana does. Uncial sort of just lifts the pen off. It doesn't sort of top those off. It's like descending pen strokes. We can see the G, we can see the H formed from a straight line and then a smaller curved line. What else do we have? We see the arches of the M. We see the N there, and sometimes they borrow a cursive N in certain forms, which we'll get to later, which is just the sort of like an upside down U, but that straight lined N is the standard Uncial version. You can notice in the R and the S they have curved forms, and now they're very obviously different, whereas in cursive script they are nearly identical. And you can see at the bottom some abbreviations and ligatures rather. So you have AE, OR. I'm honestly not. I think that's an OS in the third abbreviation. So the third abbreviation in the last line. Then you have UM, UNT, UR, and US. So these are your Uncial letter forms. Also, frankly, it's really pretty. Like I think Uncial is my favourite medieval script. It's just beautiful. It fits so many different grades. It screams medieval and ancient to me, and it can have like Roman vibes. It can also have medieval vibes. I just love it. I really love it. And we'll mention this later, but it's associated a lot with Christianity, more so than the Litera Capitalis Rusticana or Litera Capitalis Quadrata scripts. Cultural context. There we go. I included a slide for it. So uncials had become a widespread bookhand by late antiquity, and they were especially popular for copying out the Bible and other Christian texts, but it was also used for secular writings. And its popularity arose at the same time that vellum, so parchment animal skins, started to be used as the main writing material over papyrus. And the reason this ensured its continuity into the Middle Ages is that while the Western Roman Empire was still active and there were government-controlled active trade networks between the Italian peninsula and Egypt, there was a ready supply of papyrus, which was mostly just produced in Egypt, coming into the West. Now, when these trade networks broke down with the Western Roman Empire, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, suddenly papyrus is a very cheap writing material and a material for bureaucratic record that wasn't available anymore, so they had to start using materials that they could make themselves, which is vellum. And among other things, this had the effect of making books and literacy much more expensive, and this is one of the reasons why it became increasingly restricted to monastic centers as centers of and also secular religious churches as centers of reading and writing in the early Middle Ages, because these were the only places which could afford to buy or to produce their own parchment for writing on. In the Middle Ages itself, to go back to Uncial script, it is rare to find manuscripts that are entirely written in Uncial. That's sort of a feature of late antiquity and the Roman Empire. But Uncial script is used in individual letters or phrases to mark the starts of sentences or paragraphs. And Uncial has local variants which you can use to identify specifically where an Uncial manuscript was likely written. And there is a particularly distinct North African school which is associated with St. Augustine of Hippo's circle. And we can sometimes use this to identify the transmission of texts, such as Augustine's texts, to the rest of the Western world. And like with these other scripts, Uncial script is going to be more finely executed, so with less influence from minuscule scripts in centers that are closer to centers of Romanitas. So the Italian peninsula basically retains Romanitas, or Romanness, longer than, say, the fringes of the empire like Britain. So Uncial is better executed in these places than at the frontiers. So this is really fun. This is one of my favourite things. So this is the St. Cuthbert Gospel from the early 8th century, and it's the oldest intact book in Europe. So this is one of those amazing moments where archaeology and history meet up. So the Venerable Bede describes in great detail the funeral of St. Cuthbert and the relics that were buried with him, and archaeologists then at one point found his body. They exhumated him and they found a coffin decorated as Bede described, with wooden inscriptions, garments like he described, and among them is this small little gospel book. It's really tiny. I've seen it in person. It's sort of like it would fit in your sort of blazer pocket kind of thing, and it's the Gospel of it's the Gospel of John, and it's written in Uncial script from the 8th century. It's really beautiful, and because it survived in a coffin, it survived with its original binding. So it has a cover that was made in early medieval England in the sort of 8th century. So this is the oldest fully intact book surviving from medieval Europe, and it's just so cool. You can read it entirely for free on the British Library website. You can look it up, 80 additional MS 89000. Really fun, highly recommend it. I'll read out the text that's on the screen for you. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum, hoc erat in principio apud. And now we're going to get to that Diem and Deus in a second, because that's very important. Here's another one. Here's a fragment of a sermon by St. Augustine of Hippo, and again, this is one of the reasons why paleography is exciting, because we can read documents like these which may not have been properly recorded and analysed, so we can understand and read new texts and learn them. It's exciting stuff. I'll read the top line out for you here. Altare Dei quo ipse non acerit cogitet, and then blah blah blah. It would take a long time to read out the whole thing. Here's a really interesting book. So it's the Abbas glossary, and it, first of all, you got this charming little drawing of a little guy. He's just vibing, he's chilling. But what this is it's a vocabulary which teaches you. On the right hand side of this page, you have standard Latin words written, and then on the left hand side you have words which are Latin sort of, but they're much more but they come from Greek, and they're much more prestigious words. So instead of saying pater for father, you would say Abba, which is what the Greeks say. A very interesting book, and also quite pretty, worth checking out. Here is another one, because in this, one of the reasons I love Uncial so much in particular is that with Uncial we start to see the transmission of texts that are written in the Middle Ages themselves. So all of the scripts, all of the texts that we've looked at written in Litera Capitalis Rusticana up until now, these scripts have been scripts that were written in the Roman era and then transmitted into the Middle Ages, whereas because Uncial script is written during the time of the Middle Ages itself, it's written in the sort of 6th and the 7th, 8th centuries, etc. We get texts that are written in the Middle Ages itself, transmitted in Uncial. So we can see sometimes manuscripts which probably look quite similar to some of the first versions of these texts surviving to us in the present day. They're not copies of copies of copies. And we can look at manuscripts which might not have looked that different to how contemporaries would have seen them. And here is an example of one of them. This is a book of the Codex Theodosianus. It's a compilation of Roman law which became quite popular in the Middle Ages. And here we have the entire chapter on land surveyors, de mensoribus. And this is relatively boring. It's basically just describing a legal dispute between about measuring land, and therefore telling you what the precedent is going to be. But But this is one example of many of interesting things you can do with script. And once again here, those words de mensoribus are not in fact written in Uncial script. They are written in Litera Capitalis Rusticana because it's a chapter heading. So you can see again how they're using different scripts for different purposes in medieval manuscripts. And this brings us on to Litera Semi-Uncialis and the concept of hierarchy of script. So Litera Semi-Uncialis, also known as half-uncial, it refers to a broad continuum of scripts which combine the capital letter forms of uncial with forms which are borrowed from cursive scripts, so the Old Roman and later Roman cursive scripts. Bernard Bischoff in 1991 identifies two broad families of uncial scripts which seem to have been relatively standardized. So you have an older Eastern form of half-uncial and a later form. We don't need to know specifically how to identify them. I can't identify them. Don't worry about it. Professor Julia Crick, who taught me paleography, and shout out to her, she's amazing, describes a hierarchy of script which exists throughout the Middle Ages, in which the relative prestige of different scripts may be discerned from their usage in particular contexts. So with the example of full uncial, regular uncial, the fact that it's so often used in the very sort of elaborate gospel books shows you that it's got these associations. And likewise, Litera Capitalis Rusticana, because it's used as the main bookhand for pagan text, shows that it has these kind of prestige and these kinds of contexts. Whereas to my knowledge, we don't really have whole gospel books written in Old Roman cursive. That's just not a very formal script. I did give you an example in the last lecture of Bible verses written in Old Roman cursive, but these are fragments, so it's hard to tell, but they probably weren't from a complete book, and if it was, it probably wasn't a very expensive one. So from the use of different scripts in different contexts, we can identify how prestigious they are, and some are more prestigious than others. So out of the ones that we've discussed, Uncial script is definitely the more prestigious script that we've seen thus far. It's used for Gospels and Christian texts. So Uncial is the standard, and deviations from the standard, which we saw earlier in the letter forms we looked at earlier, those are the corruptions, basically. And corruptions are going to imply a less prestigious project, or a less well-trained scribe, or a lazy scribe, because again, remember that cursive scripts are easier to write by definition. So if you're going to get lazy, you're going to include cursive letter forms, and when you have a lot of cursive letter forms included, we call the script half-uncial instead. Early half-uncial. So Bischoff describes early half-uncial as a calligraphization from cursive scripts. So it's actually, according to him, basically it's cursive script, but they try to make it like uncial, and therefore it starts to look like a sort of middle ground between the two. And it's attested in manuscripts almost exclusively of Egyptian provenance, suggesting that it developed probably in this region. And it dates from the 3rd to the 5th century Common Era, and it has both a slanted and an upright variant, which we do not need to know, but it's interesting and worth noting that that uncial script in general came from Greek-speaking, developed and was popularized in Greek-speaking areas of the Roman Empire, so it comes from Greek influence, and indeed there is a Greek uncial script for the Greek alphabet. And so Egypt, being a part of the Hellenosphere, speaking Greek, would not be that surprising that they would have a developed tradition of writing uncial there. It's also fascinating and worth noting that the Gothic language and alphabet also, although we have very little evidence for it, paleographic evidence, in the Naples deed we see a slanted variety, and in the Codex Argenteus we see an upright variety. So this might be a product of the influence of Gospels and such written in uncial, half uncial, which might well have been circulating in Italy at the time, because, the 5th century, you would have had some of these texts perhaps in Italy. It's hard to say, But or it might just have been that uncial scripts generally lent themselves to slanted and upright varieties. Who knows? But it's worth noting. And so the defining characteristics of early half-uncial are B, H, and D rising above the minimum line, F, Q, P, and R which go below it. The vertical strokes are actually thicker, which is a characteristic of the Greek influence. You have a bent shoulder stroke on the R, which we'll see what that means in a second. And you have a majuscule, so a sort of tall S, not a curved S. That's usually the first sign that you're dealing with half-uncial, is that you see the tall S. And you also see the rounded A, which is borrowed from cursive script. So let's have a look. Here's an example. I don't remember what the text of this is, but here we are. It's early half-uncial, and I will read out the first couple of lines from you. It says, ab initio nec timens aliquem veniam davas peccati. What's that? I think that's chillorum. So davas peccati peccatis illorum, dabas peccatis illorum, and then you've got a sort of clause marker. So from the beginning, ab initio nec timens aliquem veniam dabas peccatis illorum. So there you go, that's an example. You can see the tall S, you can see the D and the B going above the minimum line, you can see the Q and P going below it. What else do we have here? Yeah, those are... Oh yes, hang on. So at the last word, ilarum, so it's, if we count back from the end, from the right hand side of the third line, M, U, and then R. So notice that the shoulder stroke of the R, it's the cursive R, which is normally just it almost looks like a hook, but this one, the stroke is curved a little bit, so it almost looks like it's halfway between the curved uncial form and the straighter cursive form. And this is again the early calligraphization of cursive writing. So now let's look at later half-uncial, which is much more important because this is the one that's going to be much more common in medieval manuscripts. So the later writers of uncial are more important, and they are often used in the transmission of classical texts. They likely originated also in Africa, but their use survived in Italy, France, and Spain into the pre-Carolingian centuries, and you'll know what that means by the end of the course. The features of later half-uncial include it's got a generally flatter appearance compared to the full uncial script. It's got a rounded G with a descender and a flat top. The flat top G is really characteristic of later half-uncial, and it really sticks, so to speak. It's one of the first signs that you're dealing with half-uncial to begin with, and then also it seems to stick around into a lot of different scripts, particularly in the insular countries, so Ireland and Britain. You also have a rounded A in later half-uncial, which is borrowed from cursive. Sometimes this looks like two C's, you'll see in a second, and then the capital N is always retained from uncial. So let's have a look. We can see an example here, and I believe these are Psalms, I'm not sure. Although frankly these are not really great to see, they're a bit small, so I'm going to go on to the next one. And this one is a really cute little thing. So it's a colophon, which is basically when a scribe writes a little notice at the end of the script, and it says, I'll read it out for you. So it says, quis legis ora proscriptorem si dominum, oh goodness, si dominum Iesum Christum habeas ad tutorem in Greus ad tua, and then ad tuate, it's sort of faded, Domino Sanctus O, and then Ribste. I really can't read that, the last two letters a bit too much, but the rest of it is, whoever reads this, pray for the writer, if the Lord should be my helper. And I don't actually know what this last line is. In Grecus additor, it doesn't make sense to me. Additor, I just really have no idea. But the point, what's really interesting in this is that the scribe has made quite a few, you made one spelling mistake. So we can see in the second word, scriptorem instead of scriptorem, which tells us that the scribe is a Latin speaker who is writing down, but is maybe not very well trained in orthographic standards of how to write, and so they're making mistakes. So not only can this tell us how the people in this time are speaking Latin, but it also shows us that, shows that they are speaking Latin, and it's the first of these kinds of mistakes that we can use to piece together how Latin was spoken in these times, deviations from standard Latin ways of spelling. And also it's just very cute. So there we go, that's a nice example of late half-uncial. I don't think we have a G that we can, oh no, we do have a G, and that's actually a sort of full-uncial G in legis, so a bad example there. Do we have an N anywhere that we can look at? Yeah, there we are. So in dominum, and that is in second line. Creditorem, see DNM, and we'll get to what that is in a second. But the N, that's the capital N, retained from full uncial. We don't have that many cursive letters here, I do have to admit. We can see that the A is quite rounded, and in habeas you can see the rounded A, which is a more cursive form that is creeping in. So TLDR, you can see this person has fairly good uncial, but some later uncial letter forms are starting to creep in and influence it in writing this colophon. And here's another one. It's quite pretty. Ignore the script at the top. According to what my professor told me, this is a script that is quite common, but we don't have a name for it yet, so don't know what to call it. But it's very nice. It's quite pretty. But if I read out the script, the uncial script, beginning in black on the left-hand side, so it's initium Evangelii Iesu Christi Filii Dei sicut scriptur est in Isaiah propheta ecce mito angelum meum ante. Okay, so another interesting thing here, again, we have exactly the same mistake. So from sicut, so sicut scriptum est, confusing the B for a P, very interesting. Do they have any other? Oh, and so if we look in the left hand side, penultimate line, the last two letters, you have that flat top half uncial G, that later half uncial G. That's quite iconic. But if we go back up to sicut scriptum est, we can see above the U there's this line with a little dot on top, and that is a abbreviation that shows you that a letter has been left off at the end. Now, very interestingly, if you watch my video on the Ostrogothic, a deep dive of the Ostrogothic cookbook, you'll remember that in vulgar Latin of the time, final M's were not actually pronounced, because in Roman times, words ending in UM would actually have a nasal vowel, and the M wasn't really pronounced. So they would have said sicut scriptum rather than sicut scriptum. And saying the M forces you to nasalize it a bit, so that's why the convention stuck. But the M is always the broadest letter in uncial in any of these scripts, really. So, and remember, now that they're writing on parchment, which is made from animal skins, it's really expensive. If you have to kill a calf or something every time you want to write something, it's really expensive. So they want to save space as much as possible. So, with the exception of gospel text, which this is, so they're going to be limited in how much they abbreviate, but they're going to carefully control the use of space, and they're going to save on their space by abbreviating wherever they can. And in Gospels it's less proper to abbreviate, but they will still do so at the very end of words. They'll chop off that final M, possibly because people weren't often pronouncing it anyway, so what's the point in keeping it? But yeah, so there we are. So you got scripted with the abbreviation on top. You've got 3 nomina sacra above, which we will learn what those are in just a second. But yeah, and there you go, a nice example of a late half-uncial script. And here we are, nomina sacra, sacred names. So as we said, uncial, half-uncial are commonly used for writing evangelia, so these are the Gospels, and for most of the Middle Ages, especially the early Middle Ages, the Gospels are actually the main books of the Bible, along with some apocrypha that get transmitted. The Old Testament doesn't get transmitted as much or as commonly in the Middle Ages for various reasons. But that's a side topic. But as a consequence of uncial and half-uncial being used for writing Gospel books, you get the words like God, Lord, Holy Spirit, Jesus coming up all the time, and so scribes want to abbreviate that because, oh God, we get it, it's Jesus, fine. So they come up with these things called nomina sacra, and as a general rule of thumb, as we go from the early Middle Ages to the later Middle Ages, the amount of abbreviation that is used in texts increases quite substantially. A large part of this is actually just the matter of accretion. So if you think one generation of scribes develops an abbreviation and they keep it, and it sort of goes on and it carries on. The next generation knows the previous abbreviation, they're quite used to writing them, but they might want to abbreviate another word or another sound, and so they add a new one and a new one and so on, until by the time you get to the sort of 1400s, you get manuscripts which are sometimes more than half the words are abbreviation. Like Domesday is a really great example. Most of the words in Doomsday books, are abbreviated words. They're not sort of written out in their entirety. So yeah, the sort of way that nomina sacra are formed, they normally keep the first letter and some middle consonant, and they just chop off the vowels, and the final letter inflects for Latin declensions. So, and they're also usually indicated by a line above the letters that are remaining from that word. So it's a superscript line, and the most common ones I've given you here in the nominative, I'll explain how to do them in the other cases, are Deus, which is written as DS, Dominus, DNS, Jesus or Christus. They actually use the Greek version, so IHS and then XPS for the Greek letters of Jesus, iota, eta, and sigma, and then chi, rho, and sigma for Jesus Christus. You have Spiritus Sanctus, which is written SPS. Apostolus is abbreviated APS, and then Episcopos is EPS. So if we take Dominus, DNS, and that's a key one. Remember this, because a lot of students get this wrong, is don't confuse DS for DNS. Very important. Especially because oftentimes DNS is referring to Jesus and DS is referring to God the Father, so important that you don't get this confused. If we want to say, so Dominus is just the Lord, and if we want to say to or with or for the Lord, we have to say Domino, and we communicate this by writing DNO. So Domino, you're going to say DNO, and if you say of the Lord, it's Domini, and you'll say DNI. So that's how you inflect nomina sacra to reflect their Latin, and you're probably starting to appreciate why in most courses that teach paleography, Latin is also compulsory, because for the most part you do need it to understand how it works. But there are vernacular texts written in the Latin script in the Middle Ages, of course, so it's useful for you as well. And to round off, let's talk a little bit about some basic codicology which you need to understand just to navigate making historical arguments about books. We're not going to get in this lecture into folio acquire reconstruction, because that's really difficult, and frankly it hurts my head. I had to do it for one of my essays once for my master's, and it hurt my brain, but it's very useful nonetheless. So basically, codicology is different from paleography in that it's the study of book production. So literally how you get the materials, how you put them together, how you distribute them, all of this lot, that is codicology. The parchment codex in medieval Europe was made up of quartos, and these are also called quatrains or quires, which are made up of individual folios. Now, a folio is basically a page, and these would be sewn together in the middle. And modern books today are likewise sewn together along the spine, and we'll learn more about this in future weeks. But the reason you need to know what this is now is that when we're making historical arguments about things and we're referring to contents of manuscripts, we refer to them by the folio reference. So a folio reference refers to the page of a manuscript in which a given portion of a transcribed text can be found, or a given image can be found. And it's stated after the manuscript reference or a shelf mark. And because every page has a front and a back side, this is referred to with the terms, oh goodness, I think I've got this wrong. Yes, recto is the front. So recto is, it's a bit hard, but when you open a book, and you have the first page, recto is the front, and then the verso is the back. I need to change this in the slides. And you always assume that the reader is turning the page towards their left, because that's what you're getting most of the time in the Latin script. Afterwards, you state the number of the folio and you give it in Arabic numerals, except for fly-leaves, which you give in Roman numerals. So let's go on and look at how you do this. So here's how you reference a manuscript. So manuscript references consist of 3 parts in the following order, not including the folio reference. So the first part is the city where the manuscript resides, because cities are more stable than geographic locations. So if you have cities in certain parts of Germany and France or whatever, which like, I don't know, Cologne or something, which historically have changed ownership at various points in history, you'd have to keep changing the title of the manuscript if you named it after the country. So we name it after the city that the manuscript is kept in, and then second part of the name is the collection it's held in, so the specific library or university or private collection that holds it thereafter. And then the third part of the name is its shelf mark within that collection. So when you go into that collection, you go to a certain shelf and you see where it is on the shelf. That is part of the manuscript reference for any medieval manuscript. So as an example, what you're seeing on the left hand screen is the very earliest fight book from medieval Europe. So it's from the 1300s. It teaches you how to fight with a sword and buckler, and this particular folio, which is my favorite, it teaches women how to fight. It has a specific stance for women to use when they're fighting with a sword and buckler, which is unique in the medieval, so really fascinating stuff. And if you want to reference this, so if you want to make an argument saying that there were specific women's martial arts styles in medieval Europe, and you want to give your evidence for this, you would say there is a woman depicted in the early fight book, Walpurga, and she has her own specific guard, and you can find this guard in Leeds Royal Armouries MS I-33 on folio 32R. So this is folio 32R that you're seeing right here. It's page 32, and it's on the sort of front side. And if you were to go to Leeds, the Royal Armouries, you need to open the book and go to folio 32R, you would be looking at that exact one. And in fact, you can look at this entire manuscript for free on the Leeds Royal Armouries website. You can download it. They're very nice about that. And here is an example from my master's dissertation showing how you can use these references in making historical arguments. So TLDR, I looked at all of the fight books written from before the 1500s showing how to use a sword in one hand, and all of them show a guard or a stance which looks like the picture on the left hand side of the screen. And we'll look here for the purpose of the lecture at the citation I give for figure 10. So it says, figure 10, the universal guard, image taken from, and this is the manuscript reference, from Rome, Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, so that's the collection it's held in, and then the shelf mark, MS Vit M 1324, and then the folio reference is folio 38R. So if you were to go to Rome, You would go to the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale, you were to go to the shelf where they have Vit M 1324. You would take that book, you would open it to folio 38R, you would see that image of the man holding a sword like that. And the reason it's important to be able to give these references is so that other people can go and check what you're saying, and so they know you're not completely making it up, and also that they can see that you're right, which is valuable. One last thing is language and script have quite an important interconnection. We'll see this more so in the lectures into the scripts, because that's when you get the Irish learning Latin who for the first time as people who were never part of the Roman Empire. That's when you really get interesting things happening with the Latin language and scripts. But you might have noticed in the manuscripts that we've looked at so far that a lot of the time they don't write spaces between their words, and this practice is called textua continua. So textua continua, no space, continuous text, no spacing between words. And the reason they're doing this is because, frankly, they're speaking Latin, and if we do this, if you write a text to your friend without any spaces between the words, your friend who's a native Anglophone will be able to understand what you're saying, no problem. And so while they were native Latin speakers in the West, and remember that after the fall of the Roman Empire, for a couple of centuries, they considered the language they were speaking to be Latin. They were speaking the language that they were writing, for the most part, with a few sort of small differences. So they didn't need to have spaces to help them identify where one word ended and another began. So when you see a manuscript written in textua continua, it indicates that the people who are writing it are Latin speakers. Sometimes also you can see phonetic errors, and these, like we saw with the scriptorium thing, they can indicate how Latin is being spoken at the time of a manuscript's production, especially if these have been corrected in a contemporary hand, because that shows you that somebody has written it a certain way because that's how they're speaking it. And oftentimes text would be recorded and copied when somebody would read aloud a text, and various scribes would write down what they heard the person saying. So if they were corrected at the same time, that means that somebody has come around and said, no, that's wrong, it's actually spelled so and so, and they go, oh sorry, and they cross it out and they write in the correct form. If you want a examination in great depth of exactly what this looks like, I recommend my deep dive into the quote-unquote Ostrogothic cookbook, because that's a really interesting book that's written in a manuscript from the 8th century, so they're definitely in a Latin-speaking region. It's from Italy, and but they've got a lot of mistakes in the Latin. They've got a lot of imperfections, which really show you the sort of vulgar Latin that they're speaking at this time. And in that video, I show you how we can get at the vulgar Latin at the time in a sort of text that's a mixture of vulgar and more classical Latin. An important thing to note though, and you'll see this in my videos where I transcribe and translate the Ostrogothic cookbook, is when we transcribe, our job is to reproduce the scribe's mistakes, so we don't correct it. So as an example, in the Ostrogothic cookbook, most commonly final M's on Latin words, they don't write them because they're not spelling them. So coriandru they'll write instead of coriandrum. But when I'm transcribing them, I just write the U. I don't add in an M, because our job is to recreate what is on the page, not to sort of give our own version of that. Here's an example of what I mentioned earlier in the incipit blah blah blah. This is a titular script. It's very interesting, and I give this as an example because here in the third line, where we see what was originally written was sustenet adolescentia, but some later scribes come through and corrected it to say sustinet adolescentia, and the corrections revert it to a classical Latin form, but the original scribe has written presumably the Vulgar Latin that they were hearing, which is not correct, basically. So you can see that process at work there. And then lastly, when Caroline script took off in continental Europe, and we'll have a lecture on Caroline, so don't worry, but that happens in the 8th century, uncial scripts begin to fade out, although they would still be used in gospel books and for rubrics as late as the 10th century. And it's these scripts survive for these purposes uncial in gospel books because gospel books are so prestigious. So if you want something luxurious, you're going to use uncial scripts for it. That's why they survived for so long. Uncial and half-uncial scripts did not die, though. They formed the basis of the Uncial script, Merovingian script, and they contributed a lot of letter forms to the Caroline minuscule script, which became very influential in the early Middle Ages. And the defining features of all of these scripts can be seen in early forms in half-uncial manuscripts. And next week we'll be looking at one of these. We'll be looking at the Merovingian script, we'll be looking at the Beneventan script, and we'll be looking at the Visigothic script. So all you Westerwiggers who are watching, if there's any of you, get like very excited for that lecture. So thank you guys for watching. There are practice slides at the end. Let me find it. Let me go to them. So there are some practice slides that you can go and have a look at. Oh, I just need to like quickly read this because this I just love it. It kills me. Okay, so this is a dialogue between a teacher and student, and it says Quare psalmi decuntur, and the guy says respondit. The student asks, why are they called psalms? And the teacher responds and said, quia per psalterium canevantur. And in English, that is, the teacher says they're called psalms because you play them with a psalter. It just kills me. Like the ultimate dad joke in like a medieval manuscript. I'm so done. Why have I got rustic capitals in here? What is this? What the hell? That's out of place. This is very out of place. Maybe this was meant to be a test. Okay. Here's some uncial, blah blah blah. And if you go on, if you follow the link in the description, you can see all of these. You can do some practice from them, etc. Feel free to send them in to me. I will mark them, give you corrections. So until next time, guys, for next week when we're doing Visigothic scripts, so valete.